For 10 years, my parents told everyone I wasn't enough. At Thanksgiving, I proved them wrong in a way they will never recover from. My name is Rachel Donovan. I'm 35 years old, and the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally made it their actual daily mission to remind me I was the wrong kind of daughter. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't the kind of thing you could brush off or chalk up to a bad day. It was relentless, calculated, and it came wrapped in the kind of smile that only a mother can weaponize. I couldn't believe it then, and honestly, part of me still struggles to say it out loud now. My sister Diane was the one they'd built their whole identity around. She was the proof they were good parents, their trophy, their narrative, their highlight reel. And me? I was the footnote. The thing they apologized for at dinner parties with a little laugh and a "Rachel's still figuring things out." I was humiliated in rooms full of people who smiled politely and said nothing, while my mother adjusted Diane's hair and called her extraordinary. The contrast wasn't accidental. It was a performance. Every family gathering felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. My father would talk about Diane's promotions, her husband, her house, and then he'd look at me with that particular kind of pity that's worse than anger. It's the kind of look that says I've given up on you without a single word being spoken. I felt the betrayal every single time, deep in my chest, like something being slowly pulled out of me. The truth was, I was drowning, and they were handing Diane the life jacket. What people don't tell you about being the failure in the family is how deeply you start to believe it. Not all at once. It's gradual, almost elegant in how it dismantles you. You start second-guessing your own instincts. You apologize for things that aren't your fault. You shrink yourself down, fold your edges in, try to take up less space so there's more room for the version of the family they actually want to show the world. I was shamed into silence so many times that silence started to feel like my native language. But here's the thing about silence. It isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. And I didn't know it yet, but something was already shifting underneath the surface of my very ordinary-looking life. I had stopped trying to earn their approval, not because I had given up, but because I was slowly, quietly, running out of reasons to keep performing for an audience that had already made up their minds. Self-worth, I was beginning to understand, couldn't be borrowed from someone else's opinion of you. The label they put on me, failure, it stuck like a bruise that never fully healed. But bruises, as it turns out, do something interesting over time. They change color. They evolve. And underneath the surface, where nobody can see, the body is already working to repair what was broken. I didn't know yet just how much I had been quietly repairing. But the people who called me a failure? They were about to find out, and not in the way any of us could have predicted. There's a particular kind of favoritism that doesn't scream, it whispers. It shows up in the way your mother sets the table, who gets the chair closest to the window, whose achievements get framed on the wall, and whose get a polite nod before the subject changes. In our house, in Portland, the hierarchy was never spoken aloud because it didn't need to be. It was architected into every single interaction, every holiday, every Sunday dinner. And I was always on the wrong side of it. The family drama wasn't loud, it was structural. My mother, Patricia, had decided early on, I think maybe before I was even old enough to disappoint her, that Diane was the one worth investing in. Not financially, not yet, but emotionally. The kind of investment that tells a child you matter before she's ever done a single thing to earn it. Diane got that investment. I got the leftovers, the distracted glances, the "we'll see," the quiet implication that I was somehow too much work for too little return. I was backstabbed by the very woman who was supposed to be my first safe place in the world. What I didn't understand as a teenager was that my mother wasn't just showing favoritism, she was building a story. A story where she was the hero, Diane was the proof, and I was the cautionary tale. And like all good storytellers, she was consistent. Every time I achieved something, a good grade, a scholarship application, a small win, it was acknowledged briefly before the spotlight swung back to Diane. The narrative was airtight, and I was living inside it without knowing I was a character being written against my will. The thing about growing up as the scapegoat is that you become fluent in a language no one teaches in school, the language of not enough, not smart enough, not driven enough, not the right kind of daughter. Dignity, for me, became something I had to find in stolen moments. In the books I read alone in my room, in the plans I made quietly, in the version of myself I was constructing in secret while the family gathered around Diane like she was a fireplace in winter. I was outside in the cold, and I was starting to prefer it. People ask me now if I resented Diane back then, and the honest answer is complicated. I didn't resent her. I resented the role she'd been handed and the role I'd been assigned, neither of which either of us had truly chosen. She was playing her part, and so was I. The difference was that her part came with applause, and mine came with silence. But even in that silence, even in all that invisibility, something in me refused to disappear completely. Something was holding on, stubborn and quiet and waiting, because here's what none of them saw coming. The girl they wrote out of the story was still in the room, and she was paying very close attention to every single word they said. I didn't tell them. Not yet. The summer I turned 19, I found out about the money. Not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no tearful confession over the kitchen table. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I overheard my parents in the hallway outside my father's office, talking in the low, practical tones that adults use when they've already made a decision and just need to confirm the logistics. My college fund, the one they'd mentioned my entire childhood like it was sacred, like it was mine, had been redirected, every cent of it, to Diane's wedding. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and yet, somewhere deep inside, I wasn't entirely shocked. Let me be very clear about what this meant. I had been accepted to a pre-med program at the University of Oregon. I had a path. I had a plan that I had built piece by piece in my head since I was 12 years old. Sitting in the back of a car reading medical journals I'd borrowed from the school library, I wanted to be a doctor, not because it would impress anyone. I had stopped caring about impressing people early, but because I genuinely believed I could help. That dream was real. It was mine, and it was gone before I even got to hold it properly. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was financial, legal, and deeply calculated. My parents had made a choice, and they hadn't even extended me the dignity of telling me to my face. My father handed me a brief, almost businesslike explanation a few days later. They'd help me find another way. My mother told me Diane's wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime moment and that I was young enough to figure it out. I was shamed in the quietest possible way. Not with words, but with decisions. And decisions, unlike words, leave paper trails. I want you to sit with that for a second. Imagine having your future handed to someone else's celebration. Imagine being told, not in anger, but in the casual, dismissive tone of someone talking about a change of dinner plans, that your dream simply wasn't as important as a wedding reception with 300 guests and a floral budget that could have paid for half my first year of tuition. The infidelity here wasn't romantic. It was parental. They cheated me out of something I could never get back. Time, trajectory, the version of myself who became a doctor. So I didn't go to medical school. I didn't have a dramatic breakdown either. I couldn't afford one. I took a part-time job. I moved into a room so small the door hit the bed when you opened it. I applied for every scholarship I could find and got rejected from most of them. I told almost no one what had happened, because even then, even at 19, I understood that the truth of what my parents had done would only be met with polite discomfort and nothing else. So I held it. I carried it quietly. the way you carry something heavy when you know no one is going to offer to help. What I didn't know yet was that losing that path would eventually force me to build something no one could take from me. But that realization was still a long way off, and before I could get there, I was going to have to survive quite a few more chapters of this story. When you lose the life you planned, you have two choices. You grieve it forever, or you build something new from the rubble. I chose to build, not because I was particularly brave, but because staying still felt like letting them win. I found my way into the tech world almost by accident, through a friend of a friend who needed help running operations for a tiny software startup in Seattle. I knew nothing about startups. I knew nothing about tech. But I knew how to work harder than anyone in the room, because I'd spent years surviving on nothing but my own effort. Karma, I told myself, had to mean something eventually. I climbed fast, not because anyone handed me a ladder, but because I made myself indispensable. I learned things no one asked me to learn. I stayed late. I solved problems before they became crises. Within 3 years, I was heading a team. Within 5, I was co-founding my own company, a health tech platform that used AI-assisted diagnostics to connect rural clinics with specialist-level analysis remotely, closing gaps that had killed people for decades. It wasn't medicine the way I'd imagined it, but it was close enough to feel like I was still reaching for something that mattered, and nobody, not a single person in my family, even knew it existed. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who grew up in families that cheered for them. I was building something extraordinary, and I was doing it completely alone. No calls of encouragement on hard days. No proud parents forwarding articles about my work. Not a single family member asking how the company was doing. Because to them, I was still the footnote. Still the one who'd never quite figured it out. The narrative was so strong by then that any evidence to the contrary simply didn't register. I had been lied about for so long that the lie had its own gravity. Every year at Thanksgiving or Christmas, when I'd make the obligatory appearance back in Portland, the dynamic was exactly the same. Diane's career, Diane's house, Diane's kids, and me, sitting at the corner of the table, nodding and smiling and quietly dying inside. Not from sadness, but from the sheer absurdity of it. I was running a company. I had investors. I had a team of people who depended on me. And I was being treated like a cautionary tale at a holiday dinner while someone passed me the cranberry sauce. The family drama had, at this point, become almost theatrical. But I didn't correct them. And this is the part I want you to really pay attention to. I didn't correct them on purpose. Not out of cowardice, but out of something that took me years to understand as strategy. Self-worth, real self-worth, doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need validation from the people who never believed in you in the first place. I was building something. I was becoming something. And I had decided, quietly, firmly, without announcement, that when the truth finally came out, it would come out on my terms, in my time, with receipts. I just didn't know yet that the universe was about to hand me a reason to accelerate the timeline. The most painful reason imaginable. Her name was Lily. She was 7 years old and she had this laugh. The kind that seemed to come from her whole body. Like she couldn't contain it. Like joy was simply too big to stay inside her. She was Diane's daughter, my niece. And she was the only uncomplicated thing in my entire family. With Lily, there was no history, no hierarchy, no invisible scoreboard. She didn't know I was the failure. She just knew I was Aunt Rachel, the one who brought the good books and remembered that she hated mushrooms and could do a really impressive impression of a pigeon. I loved her the way you love the things that restore your faith. The diagnosis came on a cold February afternoon. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words landed on our family like something physical, heavy, indiscriminate, devastating. I remember where I was when Diane called me. I remember every detail of that phone call, the sound of my sister's voice stripped completely of its usual composure. the specific silence between sentences that told me this was serious in a way that nothing in our family had ever been serious before. I was on my way out of a board meeting. I sat down on a bench in the hallway and I didn't move for 20 minutes after we hung up. What happened next was complicated in a way that only family trauma can be. I tried to be present. I flew to Portland. I visited Lily in the hospital. I offered to help with costs. But I was never fully included in what was happening. Medical decisions, treatment timelines, updates from the doctors, all of it flowed through Diane and my parents in a tight, self-contained circle that I was perpetually adjacent to, but never quite inside. The betrayal wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet kind. The kind where you're physically in the room but emotionally locked out of it. I was shamed by proximity without ever being given the chance to belong. I sat next to Lily's bed on a Tuesday in April and read her 3 chapters of a book about a girl who could talk to birds. She fell asleep halfway through the 2nd chapter, and I kept reading anyway, just to feel useful. I held her small hand, and I made a private kind of promise, the sort you make not to God or to fate, but to yourself, that I was going to do something. I didn't know what yet. I just knew that the size of what I felt for this child was too large to simply sit inside grief and do nothing. Love, at its core, is not passive. Lily died on a Thursday in October, 13 months after her diagnosis. She was 8 years old. And the world, as far as I was concerned, became a slightly different shape that day. A shape I've never fully gotten used to. The hole she left wasn't the kind you fill. It's the kind you learn to carry. And in the weeks that followed, as my family processed their loss in the way they processed everything, as a unit that didn't fully include me, I found myself alone with a grief so large and so specific that it almost felt like a second diagnosis. But grief for me has never been the end of a story. It has always, eventually, become the beginning of something else. And what came next, what I was about to be forced to choose, would define the rest of my life in ways I couldn't have predicted standing there in the hospital corridor, watching them wheel Lily's empty bed away. October 22nd, 6:47 a.m. The call came 6 days before Lily's funeral. My lead investor, the one who'd been with my company since the beginning, who believed in it when almost no one else did, called to tell me we had one shot, one pitch meeting, with a healthcare consortium in Chicago that could save the jobs of 30 people on my team. 30 people who had mortgages, families, rent, kids in school. The meeting had been rescheduled twice already. It could not move again. And it fell on the exact same day as Lily's funeral. I couldn't believe the timing. I remember standing in my kitchen, a phone in each hand, feeling the weight of both like a physical thing pressing down on my chest. I want you to understand the moral geometry of this moment. On one side, a child I loved, a funeral in Portland at 11 a.m., a family already blaming me for not being present enough during Lily's illness. On the other side, a pitch in Chicago at 9 a.m., same morning, same hour, impossible to bridge. I called airlines. I checked every connection between cities. I called the funeral home directly, asking if the service could be moved even 1 hour. I called Diane. I called my mother. Neither picked up. There is no instruction manual for this. There is no version of this choice that doesn't cost you something irreplaceable. I chose the pitch. I got on the 5:30 a.m. flight to Chicago. I walked into that conference room, and I saved every single one of those jobs. It was one of the best performances of my professional life. Sharp, precise, completely devastating in the best possible way. And the whole time I was speaking, there was a part of my brain running a parallel track, sitting in a church in Portland, watching them lower Lily into the ground without me. I was humiliated by my own choice, not by anyone else's judgment yet, just by the impossible reality of what I had done and what it had cost me. My family found out I wasn't there before the day was over. Diane called first, then my mother. And the calls were not compassionate. They were furious in the cold, precise way that Patricia had always reserved for moments when she could be most destructive. I was told I didn't love Lily. I was told my absence was proof of everything they'd always believed about me. The betrayal was reframed instantly, as if the decade of exclusion, the redirected college fund, the years of being locked out of decisions hadn't happened at all. Now I was simply the monster who missed her niece's funeral. What no one said, what no one even acknowledged, was that I had spent the 2 previous days calling, asking if I could attend a private viewing before the funeral, asking if there was any way to be included remotely, trying everything I could think of to bridge the unbridgeable. Those calls went unanswered, and that silence, that specific silence, told me everything I needed to know about how my absence would be used. But I held that knowledge quietly. I added it to a growing list of things I was going to let the truth explain, eventually, in its own time, with evidence that couldn't be argued with. I got back to my hotel room that night, and I sat on the floor for a long time. And then I opened my laptop and started making plans. Not out of revenge, not yet, but out of something that felt more fundamental. The need to make Lily's death mean something bigger than the story my family was already building around it. Within 48 hours of Lily's funeral, the story had already been written, and I was the villain. My mother had a gift for narrative construction, I'll give her that. She could take a complex, painful, morally ambiguous situation and reduce it to something clean and damning. And so my absence became not a tragic, impossible choice, but evidence. Evidence of my selfishness. Evidence that I'd never really loved Lily. Evidence, and this was the part that made my blood run cold, that I had always been exactly what they'd always said I was. The family drama had found its final chapter, and they'd cast me in the role without my consent. The calls started within the first week. Extended family, aunts, cousins, people I hadn't spoken to in years, began reaching out, not to offer condolences, but to let me know, in their careful, veiled ways, what was being said about me. I was the daughter who hadn't shown up. I was the one who always put work first. One cousin actually said, and I'm not paraphrasing here, "At least now everyone can see who you really are, Rachel." The injustice of it was almost surreal. I had been backstabbed by the people who were supposed to know me best, and the weapon they used was the worst day of my life. Here's the thing about being someone's scapegoat for long enough. You become almost professionally prepared for moments like this. The shock was real, but the mechanism was familiar. Patricia had spent years perfecting this exact maneuver, taking something I did, stripping it of context, and presenting it as a character verdict. The only difference now was that Lily was gone, and that made the stakes infinitely higher, and the lie infinitely crueler. They had weaponized a child's death, and they had done it with the practiced ease of people who'd been rehearsing for years. I did not call my mother back. I did not issue a public defense. I did not draft an email explaining my impossible choice or reminding anyone of the 30 jobs that now existed because I had been in that conference room in Chicago. And every instinct in me screamed to do exactly that, to pick up the phone, to explain, to make them understand. But I had spent 35 years trying to make them understand, and I had learned, slowly and painfully, that understanding was not what they were interested in. The truth meant nothing in a courtroom that had already delivered its verdict. So I went quiet. Deliberately, strategically quiet. Not the quiet of surrender, but the quiet of someone who has just decided to change the rules of the game entirely. I stopped attending the family events. I removed myself from the group chats. I answered no calls from my parents or extended family. And from the outside, I imagined this looked like exactly what they said it was. Guilt, retreat, the behavior of someone who knew she'd done something unforgivable. I let them think that. I let them build the story higher and wider and more elaborate, because the taller you build something on a false foundation, the more spectacular the collapse. And I was already, quietly, methodically, with a clarity I had never felt before in my life, building the foundation of something true. They had no idea what I was building, not even close. The first time I visited Lily's grave was 3 weeks after the funeral, on a Tuesday morning when I was certain no one from my family would be there. I brought a book, the one we'd been reading together in the hospital, The Girl Who Could Talk to Birds, and I sat down on the cold ground and I finished the last chapter out loud. I don't know if I believed she could hear me. I don't know if I believe in much at all when it comes to things like that. But sitting there, talking to her, finishing the story we'd started together, it was the only thing that felt honest in a world that had become almost entirely constructed out of lies and injustice. The grief I was carrying wasn't simple. It never is when it's tangled up with guilt and love and injustice all at once. I had missed her funeral. That was true. I would carry that truth with me for the rest of my life, and no amount of justification would ever make it feel clean. But guilt and love, I was discovering, don't cancel each other out. They coexist, uncomfortably, and what you do with that combination defines you. I was humiliated by my absence. I was shamed by the story my family was telling. But underneath all of that, there was something more powerful than either, a love for Lily that was still alive and had nowhere to go. So I started thinking about what she would have wanted, not in a sentimental, surface-level way, but seriously, practically, with the same strategic brain I used to build my company. Lily had been bright. She had been curious. She had asked questions about why things worked the way they did with the kind of intensity that most adults lose somewhere around age 10. She had told me once, in the hospital, in that matter-of-fact way that sick children sometimes speak, that she hoped someone would figure out how to make kids like her not so sick anymore. She was 8 years old. She said it like she was requesting a weather change. I had held that sentence inside me ever since. The clarity, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It came quietly, the way most important realizations do. I was sitting at my desk late one night, looking at financial projections for my company's acquisition offer, and something shifted. Not the numbers, the purpose. I had built something valuable. I was about to be handed a significant amount of money. And Lily had said she hoped someone would figure it out. Those 3 facts, held together at the same time, produced something that felt less like a decision and more like an obvious next step. Self-worth, I realized, is most fully expressed not in defense of yourself, but in service of what you love. I began making calls the very next morning. Not to my family, not to journalists or lawyers or anyone who might accelerate the conflict. I called researchers. I called hospital foundations. I called the people running AI diagnostic programs specifically designed to detect pediatric leukemia earlier. Programs that needed funding to expand into under-resourced regions where children like Lily were still being diagnosed too late. And every conversation confirmed what I already suspected. The need was enormous, the funding was scarce, and the impact of real investment would be measurable, documented, and lasting. And nobody, not my mother, not my sister, not a single person in my family, had any idea it was happening. I didn't tell them, not yet. My company was acquired 14 months after Lily died. The number was significant enough that I won't say it here, not because I'm being coy, but because the number was never the point. What mattered was what I did with it. Within 30 days of closing the deal, I had already structured the first donation. Anonymous. Clean. Targeted directly at a pediatric oncology research lab at the Children's Medical Institute in Boston, one of the leading programs in the country studying the specific type of leukemia that had taken Lily. The transaction was quiet, deliberate, and completely invisible. Just the way I wanted it. People talk about revenge like it's a hot thing, something loud and explosive, something that requires witnesses. But the revenge I was building was cold. It was patient. It was engineered with the kind of precision you only develop after years of being underestimated. Every donation was a brick. Every research milestone funded was a wall. I was constructing something that would eventually be impossible to deny. a monument built entirely out of the love my family had spent years insisting I didn't have. The karma in that symmetry was not lost on me. They said I didn't love Lily. I was writing love letters in the only language that couldn't be argued with. Results. Year 1, $480,000. Year 2, $720,000. Directed across 3 separate research programs, including an AI early detection initiative that flagged high-risk cases in rural clinics before symptoms became critical. By year 3, I had co-funded a diagnostic protocol that reduced the average time between first symptoms and confirmed diagnosis for pediatric ALL by almost 40%. I read the published findings on a flight from Portland to New York, sitting in economy, because old habits die hard, and I cried quietly into a napkin for 20 minutes. 38 children had received earlier diagnoses in the first 6 months alone. 38 children who had more time because Lily's story had become a mission instead of just a loss. My family, during all of this, was still performing their version of events. Holiday dinners continued without me. The narrative of Rachel who didn't show up was maintained with impressive consistency. My mother had even, according to secondhand information from a cousin who still spoke to me quietly, begun to describe me to new acquaintances as estranged, a word that implies I had walked away without reason, that the distance between us was somehow my invention. The infidelity to truth was breathtaking. I had been cheated out of my education, my grief, and now my own character. And the lie just kept growing. But I had stopped being angry about it. That's the thing nobody tells you about genuine, purposeful action. It metabolizes rage. Every dollar I directed toward research was a dollar I wasn't spending on bitterness. Every life I helped extend was evidence of something my family couldn't manufacture. The real me, documented in the only record that actually matters. The one that exists whether or not anyone is watching. I was building a legacy in secret, and I was doing it for Lily, and for the 38 children, and for the hundreds more still to come. But I would be lying if I said there wasn't also a part of me that was doing it for the moment when the secret would stop being a secret. That moment was still years away. But I was beginning to sense, in the way you sense a change in weather before it arrives, that it was coming. By the end of year 6, the number was $4.6 million. I know exactly how that sounds. I'm not saying it to impress you. I'm saying it because it matters. Because it is the most concrete, irrefutable, undeniable piece of evidence in a story that my family had spent years trying to bury under a narrative of their own construction. $4.6 million, routed across 7 research initiatives, 2 hospital partnerships, and 1 dedicated pediatric oncology fellowship program. Not 1 cent of it traceable back to me by name. Not because I was hiding, but because I understood something that most people don't. The truth is always more powerful when it's delivered on your terms. The impact had grown in ways I hadn't fully anticipated when I started. The early detection protocol I helped fund in year 3 had by now been adopted by 11 hospital networks across the country. The fellowship program had produced 4 graduating researchers actively publishing work on treatment resistance in pediatric leukemia. There were children, real children, with names and backpacks and opinions about which cereal is best, who were alive and in remission because of research my money had made possible. I want you to hold that, not as an abstraction, but as a fact. Real children, real lives, real futures that existed in direct proportion to a love that my family had publicly declared non-existent. And here's the part that should make you pause. I knew all of this. I had tracked every grant, every publication, every outcome. I had a private folder on my laptop, just a folder, nothing elaborate, where I kept the data. Not obsessively, not vengefully, more the way you keep photographs of something you love, because it matters, because it's real, because you want to be able to look at it on the days when the world tries to convince you that you're nothing. The truth was all there, organized and waiting. It had been waiting for 6 years. and it was patient in the way that only things built on solid foundations can afford to be. 6 years is a long time to carry a secret. And I want to be honest with you about what that cost me. Because the story isn't just about triumph. There were nights when I sat alone in my apartment in Seattle and felt the full weight of everything. The isolation, the grief, the absurdity of being simultaneously celebrated in rooms my family would never enter and dismissed at every table they invited me to sit at. I had self-worth, real and earned self-worth. But self-worth doesn't make you immune to loneliness. It just makes the loneliness less likely to destroy you. But something was changing. My cousin, the quiet one, Elena, the one who'd been passing me information in whispers for years, called me in early November to tell me that my parents were organizing a Thanksgiving dinner. A proper one, apparently. Extended family, the whole production. And they were including me in the invitation. Not warmly. But the invitation existed. And my mother had apparently said, Elena reported this with a mixture of discomfort and clear relish, that it was time for Rachel to come back to the table. I almost laughed. The table. As if the table had been neutral territory all along. I accepted the invitation. But I didn't go empty-handed. Because after 6 years of silence, of building in the dark, of letting the truth accumulate until it could no longer be contained, I had decided that it was finally time. And when they found out what I'd been building, it wasn't going to go the way any of them expected. I arrived at my parents' house in Portland on Thanksgiving evening with a guest. His name was Dr. Marcus Webb, the director of the Children's Medical Institute Foundation in Boston, the organization that had been the primary recipient and administrator of my donations for the past 6 years. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, with the particular kind of calm that comes from decades of sitting in rooms with grieving parents and still choosing to show up every day. I had called him 3 weeks before and explained the situation. He had listened without interrupting. And then he had said very quietly, "I'd be honored to come." He brought a folder. I told him we wouldn't need it until after dinner. Walking into that house was one of the more surreal experiences of my adult life. The smells were exactly the same. Rosemary, something baking, the specific warmth of a house that's been closed against November cold. My mother met me at the door with a smile that was perfectly calibrated to convey graciousness without affection. My father shook my hand, which told me more than any sentence could have. Diane was in the kitchen and came out when she heard my voice, and her expression, just for a fraction of a second before she composed it, showed something I hadn't expected. Guilt. Real. Complicated. Unmistakable guilt. I filed that away. Dinner was everything a family gathering can be when everyone is performing normalcy over a fault line. The conversation was careful. The topics were managed. The wine was poured with the kind of deliberate regularity that suggests people are using it as punctuation. My aunt asked about my work in the vague, disinterested way people ask about things they're not actually curious about. My father made a joke about Seattle weather. My mother talked about Diane's new kitchen renovation with the enthusiasm she reserved exclusively for Diane. I ate. I smiled. I answered questions with just enough information to seem present, and just little enough to seem ordinary. I was the most normal I had ever been at that table, and it was entirely intentional. Dr. Webb sat beside me and was gracious and warm, and said very little about himself. He asked questions about Portland, about the family, about the meal. He complimented my mother's cooking, which I noticed she received with visible pleasure. She had no idea who she was charming. I watched the room the way I'd watched rooms for years. The dynamics, the power flows, the small, invisible negotiations between people who share history. And I noticed something that surprised me. My family was nervous. Not obviously. But there was a tension underneath the performance, a collective awareness that my showing up with a stranger represented something they couldn't fully read. They were off balance, and they were trying to hide it. After dessert, when the dishes had been cleared and the conversation had reached the particular lull that long family dinners always hit, I looked at Dr. Webb. He looked at me. And I turned to the table and said with the most ordinary voice I could produce, "I want to tell you all something, and I'd like Marcus to help me explain it." My mother tilted her head in that specific way of hers, part curiosity, part preemptive defense. My father set down his coffee cup. Diane went very still. And for the first time in years, in that dining room where I had been humiliated and dismissed and quietly erased, the room was entirely focused on me. I had waited 6 years for exactly this kind of silence. I started by saying Lily's name. Just that, her name, spoken plainly, into the middle of all that careful Thanksgiving quiet. And the effect was immediate. The room shifted. The performance stopped. Something real came flooding in. I saw my mother's face change first, the composure cracking just slightly at the edges, the way ice does before it breaks. Diane looked down at the table, and I thought, good. Not cruelly, but with the clarity of someone who has waited a very long time to say something true in a room full of people who have practiced saying false things with tremendous skill. I told them that for the past 6 years, I had been making donations. I said the number plainly, $4.6 million, directed entirely toward pediatric leukemia research, in Lily's memory. The silence that followed was the kind you could feel on your skin. I watched my father's jaw tighten. I watched my aunt look at my mother with an expression that contained a whole conversation. I watched Diane's hand move to her mouth, and I watched my mother, Patricia, the architect of the narrative, the woman who had spent 35 years writing my character for other people, go completely, utterly still. Then Dr. Webb opened the folder. He didn't make a speech. He simply laid the documents on the table, one by one, passing them around the way you pass evidence rather than conversation. Grant records moved from my father's hands to my aunt's. Research outcomes landed in front of Diane. She read them slowly, without looking up. Impact reports. A formal letter from the Institute acknowledging the permanent endowment in Lily's name. And then, the thing that broke something open in that room permanently, photographs. Children who had received earlier diagnoses because of the AI protocol my funding helped develop. Children in remission. Children alive. My aunt said quietly, "Oh my God," and set the page down with both hands. The family drama in that moment stopped being drama. It became something else entirely. A reckoning. The story my mother had told for 6 years, Rachel who didn't love Lily, Rachel who chose work over family, Rachel the failure, Rachel the villain, was being dismantled in real time, document by document, life by life, with the kind of methodical thoroughness that left absolutely no room for reinterpretation. The truth was not a feeling or an argument. It was a paper trail, and it was comprehensive. My mother tried to speak. She started a sentence. "Rachel, I think what people need to understand is..." And my father said her name just once, quietly. She stopped. She tried again, a different angle. "This doesn't change what happened at the funeral." And Diane, without raising her voice, said, "Mom, stop." 2 words. The room went still. For the first time in my memory, the narrative machine that was Patricia Donovan had been shut down, not by me, but by the evidence, and by the daughter she had always protected. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at her, and at all of them, and said, "I loved Lily. I have always loved Lily. And this is what that love looked like." And then I let the documents speak for themselves. Because the truth, when you've given it 6 years to become fully itself, doesn't need any help from you. The collapse wasn't loud. That's the thing that surprised me most. I had imagined in the years of building toward this moment that the revelation would produce something explosive. Tears, shouting, the dramatic scenes you see in movies where everything falls apart at once. But real collapse, I learned, is quieter than that. It's the specific silence of people who have just discovered that the story they've been telling about another person, about themselves, about what they're capable of, was wrong. Not complicated wrong, just wrong. And my family, in that moment, looked like people standing in a building they had just realized was made of paper. My mother didn't cry immediately. She sat very still for a long time, which was somehow worse than tears would have been. I watched her eyes move from the documents to Dr. Webb to me and back again, and I could see her trying to find the angle, the reframe, the pivot, the version of events that would allow her to retain the position she'd held for decades. But there wasn't one. You can't reframe $4.6 million. You can't reframe the names of the children. You can't reframe a center that's about to be built in your granddaughter's name because of the daughter you spent 30 years treating as disposable. The facts were the facts, and they were everywhere. My father did something I hadn't anticipated. He started to cry. Not performatively, quietly, looking at his plate, in a way that seemed more like something releasing than something performed. I felt something complex watching him, something I didn't have a word for. Not softness, exactly. Not forgiveness. More like the recognition of a human being who had made choices he couldn't undo and had just been made to fully understand their cost. I didn't comfort him, but I didn't look away either. I let it be real. The extended family, my aunts, a few cousins, were watching all of this with a particular quality of attention that I recognized from years of being the subject of family conversations I wasn't present for. They were recalibrating. I could almost see it happening in real time. The revision of the story they'd been told, the reassessment of their own role in circulating it, the dawning discomfort of people who had judged me on secondhand information and were now sitting across from the actual evidence. I didn't say anything to make it easier for them. I just let the truth do its work. The only person in the room who seemed fully present, not performing, not protecting, not managing, was Diane. And what I saw on her face wasn't just surprise. It was something much older and much more complicated. It was the face of someone who had understood for a long time that the story her mother told wasn't quite right, and who had chosen again and again the comfort of staying inside it. She was looking at me the way you look at someone you've wronged when you finally run out of ways to avoid knowing it, and I held that. I held it without turning away because she deserved to sit inside it, and because I needed to see whether what was underneath it was real. What I saw underneath it was, and that changed things. Not everything, not quickly, but in a direction that mattered. Dr. Webb was precise and methodical in a way that I will forever be grateful for. He didn't editorialize. He didn't make speeches about my character or the injustice of the situation. He simply presented the documentation the way a scientist presents data, clearly, sequentially, with references. Grant agreements, financial statements, research outcome reports certified by independent academic reviewers. A letter from the board of the Children's Medical Institute formally acknowledging the size and impact of the contribution. And then, the piece that I think landed hardest, a 2-page summary of the AI diagnostic protocol, with a chart showing the reduction in diagnosis delay and, in a column on the right side of the page, the number of children who had received more timely treatment as a direct result. Numbers, unlike feelings, cannot be argued with. My mother had spent 30 years arguing with my feelings. She had reframed my grief, questioned my motives, reinterpreted my choices. But she could not reinterpret 4.6 million. She could not reinterpret 73 children who had received earlier diagnoses. She could not reinterpret the formal institutional letter on the letterhead of one of the most respected pediatric research centers in the country, thanking a donor whose love for one child had, in the most measurable way possible, extended the lives of hundreds more. The documentation was not a claim. It was a record. And records, unlike narratives, don't change with the storyteller's mood. My aunt, my mother's sister, one of the primary conduits through whom the family gossip had always traveled, picked up one of the pages and read it carefully. She set it down. She picked up another. I watched her face move through something I can only describe as the rearranging of an assumption she'd been holding for years. She looked at me across the table with an expression that was part apology, part awe, and said nothing. I nodded. That was enough. There are some reckonings that don't require words, just the shared acknowledgement that something has shifted, permanently and irrevocably, in the architecture of a family's truth. The betrayal had always been concrete: the redirected college fund, the exclusion from decisions, the narrative construction. But I had never been able to prove it in a room with all of them present, because proof of emotional betrayal requires witnesses who are willing to see, and most of my family had been deeply invested in not seeing. What Dr. Webb's documents did, the brilliant, unintentional genius of it, was bypass that entirely. The proof I brought wasn't proof of what they'd done to me. It was proof of who I actually was. And who I actually was made what they had done to me impossible to sustain as anything other than what it was: wrong. There was one moment, brief, easily missed, where my mother reached toward the documents as if she might rearrange them, as if the physical act of moving paper could shift what it said. And then she stopped. She put her hand flat on the table instead. And in that gesture, in that pause, I watched something I'd been waiting 35 years to see. My mother choosing not to fight a truth she couldn't spin. It was a small moment. It was enormous. And it told me everything I needed to know about what came next. Diane called me the following Monday. I almost didn't answer. Not out of anger, but out of a kind of protective instinct, the same one you develop after years of reaching out to someone and having the gesture used against you. But I answered, and the voice on the other end of the line was not the voice of my composed, carefully curated sister who had spent decades playing the golden child with professional-grade consistency. It was someone younger, somehow. Someone who sounded, for the first time in my memory, genuinely uncertain. "Rachel," she said. And then nothing for a long moment. And then, "I don't know where to start." I told her that was okay, that she didn't have to start anywhere in particular, that I wasn't going anywhere, and I meant it, not as a performance of generosity, but as a literal fact. I had spent 6 years building something out of love and loss and purpose. I wasn't fragile anymore in the way I had once been. I had, somewhere along the line, become someone who could afford to be patient, not because I had forgiven everything, but because I understood that reconciliation, if it was going to mean anything, had to be built on truth rather than comfort. And for the first time in our shared history, truth was the thing we had most in common. She talked for a long time. About Lily, about the funeral, about the years before that, the dynamic she'd benefited from without fully naming, the choices she'd made to stay inside the family's narrative because stepping outside it felt too costly, too disorienting, too much like losing the only definition of herself she'd ever known. She didn't excuse herself. That was the thing I kept noticing. She wasn't constructing an explanation that would let her off the hook. She was just telling me what had been true and trusting me to hold it without using it as a weapon. It was the bravest thing I had ever heard her do. I didn't tell her that everything was fine. It wasn't. There were years between us, years of exclusion and silence and the specific damage that comes from being left out by someone who could have chosen differently. Those years don't evaporate because one honest conversation happens. But I also didn't tell her there was no path forward, because there was. I could feel it, narrow and uncertain and requiring a great deal of patience from both of us. But real. Self-worth, I had learned, isn't diminished by choosing to extend a hand to someone who took too long to reach back. It's actually confirmed by it, because it means the reaching comes from wholeness rather than need. We didn't resolve everything on that call. We weren't supposed to. What we did was establish something new, a conversation that wasn't managed or performed or filtered through our mother's version of events. A conversation between two adults who shared a loss and a history, and, underneath all of it, a love that had never quite managed to kill itself, despite everything that had been done to it. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a few minutes in my apartment in Seattle. Outside, the rain was doing what rain in Seattle does, which is to say, being extremely committed to itself. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time in relation to my sister. The faint, tentative possibility of something like hope. It wasn't reconciliation yet, but it was the honest beginning of one. And honest beginnings, in my experience, are worth more than perfect endings. 4 months after Thanksgiving, the Children's Medical Institute broke ground on the new center. The Lily Donovan Pediatric Research Wing, 12,000 square feet dedicated entirely to early-stage research in pediatric blood cancers, funded by a permanent endowment that would continue generating research capital long after I was gone. I stood at the groundbreaking ceremony in Boston on a bright March morning with Dr. Webb on one side and Diane on the other. Diane, who had asked to be there, who had asked quietly and without expectation, and whom I had said yes to without hesitation. My parents were not there. That was a choice I made consciously, and I made peace with it. Watching them break ground on that building was one of the strangest experiences of my life. Because it was happening, and it was real, and it had Lily's name on it. Her name, which I had heard spoken in grief and love and weaponized accusations so many times over the past 7 years that it had become almost unbearable. And now it was carved into a cornerstone, permanent, institutional, beyond anyone's ability to distort or retell. The truth of who Lily was, and the truth of what I had done in her memory, was now architectural. You couldn't argue with a building. The research team that would inhabit that wing included 3 of the 4 fellows from the program I had funded. Young doctors, sharp and driven and deeply committed to work that most people never think about until it becomes personal. I shook their hands and listened to them talk about their research, and I felt the specific, overwhelming satisfaction of someone who has watched a single seed become a forest. Lily had told me she hoped someone would figure it out. These people were figuring it out. And the line between her hope and their work ran directly through the choice I had made, in grief and anger and love, to do something rather than nothing. The legacy that began with a redirected college fund, a decade of dismissal, and a loss so profound it reshaped my understanding of what I was capable of. That legacy now had a permanent address. And what I want you to understand is that it was never about the money. Not really. The money was the mechanism, but the engine was something simpler and stranger and more human: the refusal to let love be erased. My family had tried, consistently and effectively, to write love out of my story. And I had spent 6 years writing it back in, quietly, in ink that turned out to be $4.6 million and a building with a little girl's name on it. The groundbreaking received local press coverage in Boston, a brief mention in a medical research newsletter, a short piece in the Institute's quarterly publication, small footprints in a large world. But the people who needed to know, who needed to hold that knowledge and understand what it meant, already knew. And that was enough. More than enough. Because the point was never the audience. The point was the fact. The irreversible, documented, structural fact of what love, expressed through purpose and patience and refusal to disappear, could actually build. I'm going to tell you something that took me a long time to understand. The thing I was looking for, the thing I thought would come from the revelation at Thanksgiving, from the documents, from the building, from the collapse of my mother's narrative, wasn't validation. I know that sounds like something people say to seem evolved, so let me be more specific. I had thought, for years, That the moment they understood the truth about me would be the moment I was finally free. That their recognition would release me from something. And what actually happened was more interesting and more permanent than that. I was already free. I had been for a while, and I just hadn't fully acknowledged it. Freedom from the need for their approval didn't come with the Thanksgiving revelation. It had been accumulating quietly, in every donation, every research call, every hour I spent building something real in the dark while they maintained their comfortable fiction. The revelation didn't give me my dignity back. It just made visible the dignity I'd already reclaimed. Self-worth, it turns out, is not something that can be taken from you and then returned by the same people who took it. It has to be rebuilt, alone, incrementally, through action. And once it's solid, it doesn't need their endorsement to stay standing. My mother and I have not repaired our relationship. I want to be honest about that because I think the honest version is more useful than the comfortable one. We have spoken since Thanksgiving. Brief, careful exchanges, the kind that happen when two people are navigating around a wound too large to address directly. She has not apologized. Not really. There was a moment after the groundbreaking when she said something that might have been the beginning of one, but it receded before it fully formed, like a wave that loses nerve before it reaches the shore. I have made peace with the possibility that the apology will never come, and more importantly, I have made peace with the fact that my life doesn't require it. What I have is this: a company I built from nothing, a research wing with my niece's name on it, a relationship with my sister that is honest for the first time in our lives, a self that has been tested by grief, injustice, and impossible choices, and has come through intact, not unscathed, but intact. I no longer need my family to tell me who I am, because I have spent years showing myself, in the most concrete and documented way I know how, exactly what I'm capable of. The truth about me is not a feeling or a claim. It's a building. It's data. It's 73 children with more time. And here is the thing I most want you to take from all of this. Not the money, not the revelation, not the collapse of the narrative at the Thanksgiving table, but this. The moment I stopped waiting for them to see me clearly was the moment I started seeing myself clearly. The moment I redirected the energy I'd been spending on their approval into something I actually believed in was the moment everything changed. They needed me to be the failure. I needed to be free. They told a story about me. I built proof. And the proof, as it turns out, was always already there. Waiting, patient, comprehensive, and entirely on my side. I'm done being the footnote in someone else's version of events. I wrote my own chapter, and unlike theirs, mine has receipts. And so here we are, at the end of a story that, honestly, I'm not sure ever fully ends. Because the real work of a story like this isn't the revelation at the dinner table. It's not the building with Lily's name on it, or the documents, or the moment my mother ran out of words for the first time in 35 years. The real work is what happens after. The quiet, daily, unglamorous practice of living as yourself when the people who defined you for decades are still in the world, still breathing the same air, still holding versions of you that no longer exist. That work doesn't make headlines. But it's the most important work there is. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you scroll past. Have you ever been the Rachel in someone else's story? Have you ever been the one they called a failure? The one they compared and dismissed and quietly erased? The one who showed up anyway? Who loved harder than they were loved back? Who built things in silence while someone else got the applause? If you have, I want you to tell me. Not because misery loves company, but because I think there are more of us than the world admits. And the only way we stop believing the labels other people put on us is by hearing each other's names said clearly, in the light, without apology. And if you've been the other side, if you've been the one who dismissed someone, who circulated a narrative, who stayed comfortable inside a story you knew wasn't quite right because stepping outside it was too hard, I want to hear from you too, not to shame you, but because I genuinely believe that the most important conversations happen when both sides stop performing and start telling the truth. What do you think you would have done at that Thanksgiving table? What would you have done with 6 years and a secret? What would it take for you to build something real in the dark, with no audience, no validation, no guarantee that anyone would ever know? Drop your answer in the comments below. Tell me your story. Tell me about the family member who underestimated you, the impossible choice you had to make, the thing you built that no one saw coming. Tell me about your Lily. Whoever or whatever that loss became a purpose inside you. This is not a comment section. It's a confession booth with the lights on. And I promise you, every single thing you share here matters more than you think. If this story reached something in you, if it touched a corner of your experience that most content never gets close to, then you already know that what we do here is different. We don't do surface. We don't do easy. We go into the rooms most people avoid, and we turn the lights on, and we stay long enough for the truth to become visible. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and come back, because the next story is already waiting. And I can promise you this. It will be exactly as complicated, exactly as human, and exactly as honest as this one. You deserve content that respects your intelligence, honors your experience, and refuses to wrap complicated things in a bow they don't actually fit. That's what this is. Come back for more of it. You've earned it.